if at any point anyone has any questions, feel free to shout them out. I can definitely talk myself, but if you got something special you want to know, I can talk all day.
However, your hammer.
This is a 3-pound. Yeah, 3-pound is what I like to work with, but at the same time, you don't need a 3-pound for everything. In fact, I think we grab this one. What we're doing right now with this small hook, I'm going to be using this 1.5-pound ball peen. That's going to let me do some finer work. And after we do this hook, we'll make a big knife. Then we'll need the big hammer.
How heavy is the anvil?
This is an 80-pound Vulcan anvil, so it's a cast iron base with a forged steel hardened top. Lets me do. It's one of my portable anvil. I've got another one that's 120 pounds, but that one is harder to move. So the first thing I'm doing with this hook is I'm drawing out the tip. If anyone's made like a snake out of Play-Doh, how do you make it? You roll it up in your hands, right? You're applying even pressure to different sides, and in doing so, you're making it long and thin. That's exactly what I'm doing, except instead of using my hands, I'm using a hammer and an anvil to squish it. So I move it back and forth and hit it at 90-degree intervals, and I'm able to draw it and make it long and pointy. So now, once it gets nice and hot, spit fire at me. You get it nice. As you can see, it's a little small, but it's definitely got a little bit of a point to it. So now, on the next piece, which will go real quick because it's such a small piece, I'm going to do what's called a scroll. A scroll in blacksmithing is where we take our tip, and instead of having a sharp point there, that you put your coat on the hook and you just impale your hand, you don't want that, right? So we're gonna bend it over and make a little curly cue, so it's a little bit nicer, a little bit more ergonomic. Now this is a tricky thing. I'm gonna do it pretty easily, but one of those things that most people struggle with because it takes a lot of pressure control. What we're gonna do is just very gently bend it over like that, and that's how we start. And a little bit more work gets us that really nice, simple twist. So, I'm going to send a little bit over more.
How hot is the fire?
This will get up to about 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. And if anyone doesn't know, steel melts at about 2,300. So it's very easy to completely destroy whatever piece, especially something so small as this, because they heat up fast. That's nice. I get most of my stuff from a place called Admiral Steel in Michigan. But, a lot of this stuff, if it's mild steel, if you're not worried about like quality blade steel, you could be using all sorts of salvage stuff. Iron is iron for a lot of the more construction, like, stuff like the hook that we're doing. It doesn't really need to be anything. So we got our curly cue there, and now I'm going to make the J. And for anyone that just joined us, feel free to shout out any questions you got. I'm happy to answer whatever questions you might have. Talk about whatever you want.
Tell when it needs to go back in the fire.
Yeah, so that's a great question. Steel and really anything, the color, the brightness of the glow is determined by the temperature. So whether it's aluminum, whether it's steel, whether it's stone, the color determines the temperature. Steel starts to glow at around 1,000 degrees, and that means that anything less than 1,000 degrees is still black to the touch. So it might be hot enough to burn through your hand, but it may look cold. So you have to be really careful with what you're working with. It gets soft when it starts to glow, so that's how you know, like, okay, it needs to go back in the fire when it stops glowing, really. So now, nice and hot. I just put a lot of work into that little curly cue on the end. I don't want to destroy it with a heavy hammer blow, so I'm actually going to do something called a selective quench, where I'm just going to touch the little tip of it so it's nice and dark, and now I can.
Is that just water that you're cooking?
Yeah, just water. If I was doing that gets a little weird, I can use the horn, just like that. And we get a nice little hook, just like that. So now we're going to go into the actual other part. The first thing I'm going to have to do, just like the other one, this is going to be the nail end. I need to taper that out and turn it into a point. But yeah, typically if I'm doing knives, I'm going to be punching in oil. That poses some environmental hazards if I accidentally like kick this over. Water is a bit nicer for that, for doing outdoor demos and stuff.
Normally you punch in oil?
Yes. Yeah, water is very aggressive. So when we're hardening steel, we want to harden it as fast as possible. And what can happen with the water is that water heats it cools it too fast. And when you do that, it can actually like tear apart the steel at a molecular level because it's heating and cooling so freaking fast.
All over Hartford Space Hill.
So,
Is this room temperature oil?
yeah, you can heat it up a little bit, but yeah, typically it's not very hot. So now I'm going to, same thing, just taper this guy out. So I use Parks 50, which is a manufactured oil, but you could be using peanut oil, canola oil, stuff like that.
Do you know what they used back in the day?
Yeah, so I mean, water was typically the most easily accessible one, but you've got different types of oils throughout history. Typically though, most iron throughout most what we think of like the Iron Age of history, they weren't really using as high of carbon as we have access to today. It was much more variable, so you could get away with a water quench historically. But you know, like olives were very common. You could use the olive oil to do it. You could do animal fat even.
Do you have a favorite?
I prefer peanut oil for its smell, but I use my manufacturer oil for like actual blades and stuff.
Okay.
Okay, so we're getting there. I'm gonna do one more heat here just to draw it out a little bit more. Now you'll notice here I'm doing lots of like light hammer blows. Lots of folks may have a perception of the blacksmiths from movies and stuff, just huge hammer swings. And that happens sometimes, but a lot of what we do, especially like in the finishing work, it looks like this. And you also don't need to be a big burly dude that just is massive to swing a hammer. A lot of it just comes down to form and forearm strength. So if you can be a thinner dude and just develop those stabilization muscles, it's not particularly difficult to get there. So now I'm going to bend this guy down, which may look a little strange at first because that's not where we want our nail, right? But what we actually are going to do are going to bend it over in the next step. Because what we want to do, sorry, fighting with the forge for a minute. We could just do a 90-degree bend, but if anyone's tried to hammer in something that's kind of a rounded edge, it's real tough to get a nice square hit. So instead what we're going to do is we bend it that way, now we're going to bend it all the way around. To do that, we have our scroll tongs. Scroll tongs are real nice handy tools that, unlike other tongs, they have rounded grips. So I can bend it without putting like deep grooves in it. So what I'm going to do, I don't even need to use the anvil for this part. I'm going to take this and just twist, just like that. Now I can take my hammer and anvil and close that down.
What's the stuff falling off of it?
That is called scale. And essentially what we're doing here, if anyone remembers high school chemistry, what happens is that chemical reactions speed up under high heat. What I'm basically doing is speeding up the reaction between air and iron, creating rust. But because there's no moisture involved, it's this flat, gray, flaky thing. And actually in old Celtic legend, iron keeps away angry spirits and fairies and stuff. So that would be useful for basically cleansing areas in the same way that we might use sage or something today. Now the very last thing we're going to do with this guy, we're going to give it a little twist, because blacksmiths love twists. And to do that, I'm just going to use two different tongs, and I'm just going to twist it. And because it's red hot, I can just do it by hand. If I tried to do this normally, you wouldn't be able to because it's, you know, cold iron. And while we're doing that final step, I'm also going to put this guy in there to start heating up for number 2. Not long. I mean, this is the second demo of the day, so it goes pretty quick. But I was able to do that in about 10 minutes. So now I'm just going to take this, and we're just, so if I can do it, we're going to rotate 180 degrees. Just like that. And I did it right. It's a little wonky right there, so I'm going to just clean it up. I probably should have started a little lower.
Come on, dudes. Hey, Owen!
Did he drop it on the ground for good luck? And if everything looks pretty straight, which it does, looks good. Looks good. Everybody agrees. Yep. We'll plunge it in the quench, which isn't really necessary because this is mild steel, so it's not going to harden and stuff, but it creates the cool sizzle that we all love. It's a little hot, actually. And there we go. We get that final hook, just like that. Here, I'll pass that around. It's wet, but not very dirty. Yeah, and that is how the blacksmith would make a hook, just like that.
Cool down really fast.
Yeah, it does. It's still like hot, but.
Where did you get your mobile forge?
And so this next one that we're going to do after, you know, because blacksmiths typically made a lot of domestic products. We make hooks, we make tools, like all these tongs are made by a blacksmith. So we do a lot of different stuff, a lot of tool repair. It's all very important stuff: hinges, candlesticks, fires, flint and steel kits, you name it. But if you're at a Renaissance fair, you obviously making knives, right? Like we're making knives. So the next one is going to be a Vikings bat. Very much a dark age knife design. Very popular in about the 10th century.
Where did you get your forge?
I built my first forge when I was like 15, like 10 years ago, 15 years ago. I'm old now, right? This guy I've had for a number of years. This is my my portable forge where I can take it. It doesn't need electricity, and I can just crank it and make a nice hot fire.
Yeah.
And you can see it's starting to get nice and hot, but I have to be careful with thicker steel like this because thicker stuff, kind of like if you ever pull out a frozen cookie dough ball and then you let it cool a little bit, it gets soft on the outside, but then you try and like smash it into cookie shape, but it's still frozen on the middle. That's what we're trying to avoid here, where we want to make sure that it's soft all the way through. Let it soak a little bit in the heat. I'm gonna switch over now to my bigger tongs and my bigger hammer, and we're gonna start actually swinging, making some cool noise. So, what I'm actually going to start with right now is the handle. So the blade profile, I've got a bar of steel with an angle cut in. We'll be working with that a little bit, but the biggest thing that needs to be done is drawn out the handle. So, kind of like this, we're making an oversized version of this knife right here. So you can see it already looks kind of like this. Good luck. So it already looks kind of knife shape, but we need to hammer out that and draw it so it's a longer thing that you can actually hold. So, to do that, we're going to use our 3-pound hammer, and we're going to whack it. Make sure the forge is good and hot. Just like this. And you can see how the steel wants to move. Now we're in the Hollywood hammer strikes. But as I strike down, you'll notice I have to go back and flatten it, because as I hit it, it's going to crush not just this way, but it's also going to widen. And with a piece of steel this tall, it's also going to want to buckle and curl over. So I need to make sure that I don't go too far, and I can kind of control it as I go. Otherwise, on the end, with it looking great in one dimension and not the other. Take water so I don't die. And again, for anyone that just joined us recently, feel free to shout out any questions you might have. I can take that from you if you're all set. Thank you. Yeah, and if anyone wants to see some of the other stuff, we've got a whole pile of stuff over here. Okay. There we go.
Is this mild steel as well?
This is actually high carbon spray steel. So this is I have to be careful with. I won't go through the whole heat treat process with this one because one, it's pretty boring to watch me like thermal cycle it, just air cool it over and over again. And two, if I quench in water like this, it will explode. Not literally explode, but it will get fractures and cracks and everything. It will explode at the molecular level.
Do you heat treat on a coal stove like their coal forge like this too?
Oh yeah, definitely. Okay. Yeah, it's really just a matter of controlling, make sure it doesn't get too hot, too cold, and that you're quenching it at the right time. Get a good uniform heat.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you guys. Now, good life lessons in blacksmithing. Whenever you're trying to do something, create something, everything goes through an ugly stage before it gets to the pretty stage. But we're kind of in that ugly stage right now, and we'll probably get deeper into it before we create something kind of pretty. So we're starting to get there, but it's still a little long. So typically you want to be in a much darker environment. So you'll see like in movies and stuff, like the blacksmith shop, we're kind of like hermits and the stuff in the dark. And there is a purpose for that, not just because we're hermit weirdos that like to do stuff in the workshop, but because it's important to be able to see the actual color. So like right now, it looks pretty bright red and glowing, but if it was dark out, you'd be able to use this like a flashlight because it's so bright. So I have to be careful when it's this bright out to not take it too far and completely melt the steel, which can easily happen. There we go. There we go. So now we're starting to get there. I'm going to take it a little bit more, and then we're going to start working on the blade.
Oh, they're doing the area that talks the whole
So now the Vikings, we're making Viking sacks. We'll talk a little bit about the Vikings. The Vikings were a very interesting culture because they really believed in their mythology and all the different like cool things that come with that. So what they did, because they had actually very poor iron in Scandinavia, but they also had beliefs that you could take your ancestors or animals and you could actually imbue your tools with the power of your ancestors. So what they would do is they would dig up some great warrior in their bloodline, char their bones, create a whole pot full of the remains of their ancestor, and then take the red hot iron, plunge it in there to get that spirit into the steel. Which most folks would know, like, that doesn't really work. However, it actually did, because what ended up happening is they did a primitive form of case hardening, where the carbon from the remains of their ancestors, from the bones, actually was dissolved into the low quality iron, creating a much higher grade of steel than they should have been able to do given the technology. So there we go. And that's where you get some of the really, really cool stuff, like the Wolfberg Viking swords that are just beautiful craftsman pieces. There we go. All right, we're getting there. So now I just got to make sure I'm good so you can see how thick that spine is by the handle. I want to thin that out a little bit more and then the handle will be just about done. Then we'll go into the blade. and we'll do some more Viking stuff. Because the other thing the Vikings did is they liked using runes, the Viking runes. You might have seen them over on our table. But we'll do it all with hammer and chisel. That is hot. This chisel specifically. We'll use a chisel to carve runes in there. And the Vikings would do it in a lot of different ways. You could use it to simply mark your tools as yours in the same way that a carpenter might write bill on all of his tools. The Vikings would say this is a tool made by someone for someone, or in the more fun way, the cooler way, is they would use it to mark and imbue properties into their piece. So I'm just going to thin this out a little bit. Get that going a little bit. Don't need my chisel just yet. I'm just getting a little overeager. And there we go. It's looking pretty good handle shape. Like that's enough material to grab there. I'm not going to because, like I said, it's about like 1,000 degrees right now. But now I'm going to start working on the blade itself.
I'm having trouble catching it. One of the story side of the blade.
So now I'm going to forge out the blade a little bit, hammer in the bevel. Then we'll carve some runes into it, and then it'll be done. Like I mentioned earlier, we won't be actually heat treating this one because that's a very boring process to watch. What you do is you basically heat it up, you let it cool. And heat it up, you let it cool. And that's really just to allow the crystal structure to set, dissolve, set, and dissolve. In doing that, it lets it practice, so that when you actually go to quench, it kind of has all the stresses worked out a little bit, so it can quench and form a really good crystal structure without risk of breaking the blade apart. Because there's nothing worse than putting all this work into a knife, then quenching and hearing the ting of the steel just tearing itself apart.
Like the opening to the Lord of the Rings TV show.
I actually haven't seen it. I'm kind of a purist in that sense. But typically, when you talk about movies and stuff, there are a few things that TV and movies get wrong about Blacksmith. The first is they usually make us out to be much more handsome than we actually are. But no, the one thing is that they don't usually use iron. To get iron, you need, if you don't see that bright red glow and everything, it's probably not iron. Or at the very least, they're not heating it hot enough. So there's a scene like Lord of the Rings where they're casting swords and everything for the Urukai and all that stuff. They're almost definitely using aluminum there because it's like this dull, barely glowing liquid. Aluminum melts at a much lower temperature. If they were using iron, it would be sparking, it would be white hot, you wouldn't be able to look at it. Or like when they're reforging the sword and everything, it's not nearly hot enough, and you definitely can't just throw shards and hit it with a hammer and have it fused together. It's just not how it works. Again, it needs to be almost melting to do that. Which is fun, it's just not what they were doing. There we go, now we're working down the blade, thinning it out a little bit, and as I'm doing this, I'm also hammering the bevel. The bevel allows us to thin out that profile so it's less to grind off in the actual process.
Even if you don't watch the show, you should just watch the opening
I will.
Scene.
Is it good?
They apparently actually film pouring molten metal into a mold in the shape of the name of the show.
Okay, I will check it out. That does sound cool. Another thing that movies tend to get wrong is the ring of the hammer and anvil. Most times you hear the ding, and if you've been paying attention, it's more of a dull thud. It's not exactly a cool sound, but the steel is so soft that it's absorbing a lot of the sound. And even an anvil like this, it has a little bit of a ring, but because it's on wood, it tends to, it's not going to ring that hard. Some anvils will ring, but by and large, they typically don't. Sorry, I just realized there we go. Sometimes this stuff moves on you. And now we're getting into an effect called sabering. Sabering is when you hammer in the bevels there. Naturally, like I said, we're thinning it out along the edge so we don't have to grind it as much. But what happens is we're not just thinning it out this way, we're also spreading it this way and that way. So we get an effect called sabering where you can see it's starting to curve. Sometimes you want that with like a saber or a butcher's knife or something like that. But we're gonna just fight that a little bit. So as we form it, we'll hammer it back down. Now we're getting to the near end. It's not easy, you know, but really it's just a stone that you carve in the shape of a wheel. Any stone will do. Sandstone is great, but it's hard. It takes a long, long time. And that's why typically, as much as we love the idea of like a knight riding in the battle with a sword, swords were very, very uncommon on the battlefield of Europe, or really anywhere, because it's just so much work to do. They were very much status symbols of like, I'm rich enough to be able to afford the sword. They're the Teslas of the medieval world. Most people were using spears because they're a little bit of steel. It doesn't even have to be fancy, it just needs to be pointy. Not even any this grinding required, it just needs to point to kill somebody. Spears were the dominant one, or like war hammers or axes, because most people already had axes for what they needed to do at home. So it was a very ineffective way to arm the country. And in fact, there's actually kind of a funny thing about history. In the early Middle Ages, most swords, blacksmiths were not always the most popular people. In general, people like blacksmiths because we make cool tools, and that's important. But there was a time in Europe where Catholicism was like dominant, don't question the church and all that. And if anyone's read the Old Testament, there's a statement in Genesis where it says the descendants of Cain became tool makers and stuff like tool makers and weapon makers, at least in some translations. And that became kind of a weird cultural thing where the blacksmiths were kind of like rejects of society. And as a result, they didn't have the best tools. They weren't especially good at their jobs. The swords of kings and princes and everything like that, you can see them in history, they were pretty bad as far as like the actual blades themselves, but then the handles were made of solid gold and crusted with gems because they were made by goldsmiths and gem setters and stuff like that, very fancy. But the steel itself was not very good. It was like wonky, it was soft, at least for a while, until they realized like, hey, maybe we need these guys to be a little bit like, we need to be nice to them. So now we're getting into the part where the blade looks pretty darn good. Is it? Okay. Well, we're finishing up. So next thing we're going to do, I'm going to hammer in my touch mark. We'll give it a couple runes, and we will send it off to battle. So blacksmiths, we all have our own marks. Some blacksmiths just have a letter. Sometimes it's just a weird shape on it to mark it as your own. There was one Viking bladesmith called Ulfberg, they think his name was, because he actually did phenomenal inlays in the sword, and it just says Ulfberg. I am using my own touch mark, which is a negative image of my logo, which you see on our board right there. And I'm going to hit it really hard with a hammer, and that's going to impart it into the blade. Once it's hot enough, it doesn't have to be super hot. Just needs to be hot enough to deform. So I'm just going to put it right there, not burn myself too bad, and there we go. So I'll hold that up for you guys. You can see that mark right there. And I'll pass this around once we actually let it cool off and everything. And that is my touch mark. So now I'm just going to do a couple Viking runes. And hopefully not burn myself too bad. There's one thing that a lot of folks don't appreciate is when it's glowing that hot, what ends up happening, the reason it's glowing is because it has so much thermal energy, it's projecting the excess energy as light energy, which also includes not just visible light, but light on a different section like UV light, and it projects a lot of heat. So you can actually ignite stuff just by the steel being that red hot, being too close. So I'm going to use this just right in front of you. And I'm going to do a few Viking runes, like probably Tiwaz, which is a popular one, meaning victory, maybe Urus, meaning strength, lots of stuff like that that are pretty common on stuff like this. But when it's blowing this hot, I may need to let my... That's good luck when you throw it on the ground. I'm taking away my hand. Because if I leave my hand there, I'm going to start to blister up, and I don't want to do that. So we got the Tiwaz right there. Just like that. So I'll do another one. Again, this doesn't have to be super hot, because I'm not moving a whole lot of steel here. I'm just moving the chisel, just like that. So I'll do a roost next, which is kind of just like that, where it goes down. And then maybe a call, which is a heretic. I'll try and do these in the single heat. Then we'll just straighten it out. I'll let it cool, and we can pass it around.
Oh, he's got the same part.
There we go.
There you are.
Oh yeah. I'm recovering from one right now.
I need to get myself up here.
Now I'll make it nice and straight.
Sticking on the back of the boat. So I think I'm going to fill the truck bed with the shot. And just go real
You just got to make sure it's nice and straight before you go into heat treat. Otherwise, you're going to fix it into a certain shape, and you may not want that. But there we go. There are the finished Viking runes. Just like that.
I just finished a bunch of stuff at the house.
But yeah, I got a burn on my finger. Usually, ironically, now that I've been doing this for a while, I don't tend to get many burns from the forging process besides the little flakes and stuff that come off. Usually it's when I'm on the grinder. Things get hotter than I realize, and I touch something I shouldn't. So now I'm just going to gently quench this. I'm not going to quench it super hard because I don't want to destroy it. But I can do that every now and then, and eventually it'll cool off. Like I said, normally you quench in oil and just hold it in there to rapidly cool it, but water is so aggressive that it tends to just tear it apart if you just plunge it in and leave it there. So normally I wouldn't do this. I would just let it air cool as we go through the heat treat, but I want to be able to pass it around so y'all can see. There we go. And really, once it becomes like that dark gray color, the risk of actually like over hardening it isn't really there. There we go. There's our finished Viking sacks. And it's still a little bit short, but I like leaving a little bit extra material because I can grind that off really, really easily so you can get a good grip. So yeah, pass that around, the old Viking runes. And that's going to conclude the last part of the demonstration. If anyone has any questions, I'm happy to hang around, talk shop, explain to you what I'm doing. But if not, thank you very much for coming. Of course, stop by our booth, see what we got. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it.